So I've been looking through my hard drive at the many projects I've wanted to do over the year and have been piling up and decided to actually go for one. Today I want to talk to you guys about the idea of True Wars 2 and what that means to me. Now, True Wars 2 is a concept. It's an idea for another theoretical game that could have existed or would have existed or will exist in the Guild Wars franchise produced by ArenaNet that is more of a spiritual successor to the original game. So, let's look at the facts here. Guild Wars 1 was a very specific styled online experience. They called it in the very early days an MMO, but eventually this term came around, the CORPG, kind of where an ARPG meets an MMO. Guild Wars 1 has a very distinct style and flavor to it that no other game has really, in all the years since it came out and has been ceased active development on, really capitalized on. That hub-based, meet people in a small outpost, go out and adventure through the world, heavily cooperative, very minimal solo play, its specific style of questing and classes and skill access and formats of PvP. It's a very distinct thing. Guild Wars 2, however, is very different to the original, antithetical in many ways as well. Guild Wars 2 sought to be a, so to speak, real MMO. It expanded the ways in which you would interact with other people in the world, making it truly online everywhere. That hub-based idea was eliminated, the classes were refined, the ways that skills worked were refined, and today, after years and years of further refinements and changes as sweeping new things like gliding and mounts has come in, the Guild Wars 2 of 2018 is almost unrecognizable when compared to Guild Wars 1. If they didn't share the same story and universe, would you really think that the same developers and same philosophies had gone behind these two products? Well, maybe in some small places. It's certainly true that ArenaNet have stayed to their word on certain ideas, particularly if you look at the way that the Guild Wars 1 gem store was handled compared with the Guild Wars 2 gem store, their philosophies on buy-to-play and microtransactions in a more expanded sense, and several other actual gameplay issues. Sure, there are some similarities, but the products are super different. And that has had its consequences. It means that there's a lot of Guild Wars 1 fans out there who feel burned by the sequel and are generally left wondering, what if? What if ArenaNet hadn't sought out to reinvent the wheel with the MMO? What if they had got into those meeting rooms in the early days, come to the decision to make Guild Wars 2, but were generally happy with their little slice of the pie that they already had, and that they were just going to iterate on, tweak, slightly refine, and generally contemporize Guild Wars 1, but not rock the boat too much? Well, that would be an interesting game, wouldn't it? The true sequel to Guild Wars 1, True Wars 2. So that's kind of the idea. Now, your answer as to what that game would look like is probably pretty contingent on how much of a fanboy for the original you are, how thick your nostalgia goggles truly have become, and whether you think the first game was absolutely perfect and just basically needs to be remastered, or whether the sequel actually has a lot of lessons to offer. I'm in the camp where I think that Guild Wars 2 did a hell of a lot of really good things, and there's probably a middle ground between the two products that would be my perfect MMO. As a long-time player of both, and understanding their pros and cons on either side, what do I now think the most successful game could have been? Well, that's what today's video is going to be. I've got a few different points I want to talk about in no particular order, but we're essentially going to pick and choose what we like most about Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 and build the Frankenstein game from it. And as I go through, maybe you can consider where your opinions differ from my own. So starting off, first of all, with number one, what I'm calling the no skill weapon lock. So, let's talk about skills. Guild Wars 1 gave you 8 slots, and you could do pretty much anything you liked within your profession or secondary profession in those slots. You could make terrible builds with no capacity to resurrect that you take into random arenas, builds with no auto attacks, builds with way too long cooldowns, builds with way too much energy costs, builds that had no way of CCing, and so on and so on and so on and so on. There was no low bar in Guild Wars 1, there was no bar at all, and it meant that there was a hell of a lot of discrimination, a lot of growing pains and stuff you needed to learn, and a lot that rested on your shoulders and initiative to learn about the game as a Guild Wars 1 player. Guild Wars 2 did away with all of that by going with a more arcadey style that forced you into certain things. You have to have a heal skill in Guild Wars 2. Sure, you might pick a pretty shoddy one, but you've got one there at least. You have to pick an elite skill. These were probably good decisions. If you think that Guild Wars 2 can be very discriminatory, well, it's better than it was in the original, I'll tell you that much. But then there was another thing the devs did, and it's certainly been a point of major controversy. Not only do they force you into an elite skill and into a heal skill, they also bind skills to your weapons. So for the left-hand side of your 10 skills, you actually don't get to choose what your sword skills are going to be as a warrior, just main hand and offhand, and you're kind of lumped with it. And this really pushed the game much more into that loadout-y style, to the benefit of making sure people had reasonably good builds, and, you know, now the designers and the balance team have got an easier job of, okay, if sword's not very good, then they can fix sword, and now all these builds are suddenly doing a bit better. But to the detriment of people who really enjoyed the Guild Wars 1 style of buildcraft and freedom. So, which one of the games did it right? Well, I do actually have a lot of thoughts on this topic, and first of all, I'll say that Guild Wars 2 is nowhere near as lacking in complexity as most people from the original give it credit for. It can take a while to realize, but if you really think about it, most traits in Guild Wars 2 are skills in and of their own right, and you get 18 of them. Whatever complexity was lost from binding the left 5 skills is really nothing in sight of the mountain of stuff that comes from traits and the way that runes work in this game and sigils work, and there's so many more effects going on. So many individual skills are worth so much more and do so much more. There's weapon swapping, profession mechanics that unlock billions of new skills for you. There's a hell of a lot more going on in Guild Wars 2, and it's not actually that bad at the end of things if some of your skills were bound to a specific weapon. But here's the thing, even if at the end of the road, I don't actually think there's much difference in buildcraft complexity and whatnot, Guild Wars 1 feels like it has more freedom. Guild Wars 1 is apparently more open. Guild Wars 1 just feels more fun to be able to meticulously tailor all 8 of your slots. And whether it's right that people feel that way or not is kind of irrelevant. The fact is, people like the way that it looked before and still grumble all the way back here in 2018 that things changed. So in my True Wars 2, I would actually go back to the Guild Wars 1 style of giving you absolute control over all slots on your bar. Whether you'd have 10 skills or 8 skills, I don't know. I'd maybe even tend a little bit on the lower side. But yeah, if that's what people feel looks better and they have so prominently for so long, even irrespective of the real output and design of the game, I'd just give it to them. Here's a sneaky little cheat as well. I think that Guild Wars 1 approximated this arcadey loadouts pretty comfortably anyway. So go back to doing that, cheat, make people feel that they have a lot of freedom, even though they obviously don't, and everyone will be happy. And while I'm at it, as I alluded to a second ago, I definitely drop the number of skills that are accessible all the time. Weapon swapping can still be a thing and definitely a fun thing, but this idea of, you know, look at like Firebrand in Guild Wars 2 right now. You get 2 different weapon sets and then 3 F keys that toggle into 3 more full weapon sets plus your utilities on the... I would not have anything anywhere near that level. I think the game would do better going back to a bit more of a simplistic combat approach, as Guild Wars 1 was. A lot of that stuff was very pure and simple, actually, in truth. So, next, let's talk about professions. Point number 2, what would you have, guys? The multiple class options of the original or a single profession from Guild Wars 2? Here, I would not favor the original. I would go with the Guild Wars 2 design of only having one class. This, a lot like the skill locking, is another one of those core baseline things, those big decisions that the devs made back in the day that is somewhat contested by the veterans. People always, even today, look back at the original and say, oh, I wish I could multi-class again. Personally, I don't think multi-classing in the original was very good at all. It didn't feel that different being a Domination Mesmer primary that was casting Curses, Necromancer secondary to the reverse of that. A lot of the casters, whether you were primary or secondary, felt pretty similar. It just came down to minor changes in energy management, and because of the multi-classing, the balance tended to suffer for it, and the devs could never do anything truly unique or interesting with each individual class because the effects had to remain generic enough that they could combo and interact with everything else that was in the game. And as more classes got added, they just became even less distinct. No, personally, I think Guild Wars 2's decision to have only a primary profession, but that profession can be oozing with flavor and unique mechanics and experiences, was the right way to go. And my True Wars 2 would still have made this decision. A necromancer is a necromancer, and no need to worry about anything else aside from providing that flavor and those experiences as deeply as possible. Some of you will be watching this video right now thinking, no, you can have both. You can have multi-classing and really distinct, awesome class experiences. To me, I would say that's naive. Number 3, let's talk about the PvE story experience. And no, I don't mean lore and setting and all that kind of stuff. I mean, what does it feel like to progress through the plot of this game? Both actually had very distinct different ways of accomplishing this. The personal story bears little resemblance to the primary quest campaign-oriented stuff from the original game. Also, the prevalence and importance of cooperative play is very different in the two games. Guild Wars 1 was all about team stuff. There was really very little idea of playing solo. If you were playing solo, you still had to fill your party out with a ton of AI henchmen or heroes so that you could tackle the encounters ahead. That whole idea of being heavily cooperative really was very fun when Prophecies first came out and there was a lot of activity for those early whiles. But then when the game had pushed to the point of having henchmen and heroes and stuff, started to break down. On the other hand, you have Guild Wars 2, a game so desperate to allow you to play solo, it's terrified to ever ask you to interact with another player whatsoever. The closest you'll find is a group dynamic event you can simply walk away from. But as far as the core story is concerned, you'll never have to open your chat box, you'll never have to join a guild, never have to make a friend, and the likeliness that you will form some community or bond with someone after tackling a difficult part of the story is pretty much near zero. Especially considering another change between the games was Guild Wars 1 wasn't scared to punish you for sucking, and it could be extremely frustrating the third time Prince Rurik aggroed something far away and got himself killed, while Guild Wars 2 has eliminated the sense of failure in story altogether. No, this might be a surprise to you guys, but it is actually impossible to fail any mechanic ever, even in current living world missions. Any sense of urgency or importance for your life is always faked. You can go AFK and you'll be perfectly fine. You can lose the boss fight and respawn at 100% health right next to your target without him having regenerated, and so on. So what's the correct mix? The hyper accessibility of Guild Wars 2 or the more punishing, cooperative, and grueling version of Guild Wars 1? Well, here I will say, let's have our cake and eat it too. What I would like most is cooperative campaign-style missions that do require players to band together, are not soloable. You will be asked to meet other people. Not as many as 8. We'll talk about party sizes in just a minute. But you will actually have moments where it's like, hey, this is a co-op mission. If you want to keep going with the story, find a buddy, meet up, chat with one another, and see what you can accomplish. Maybe they can be solo possible, but the idea would be they be designed for multiple players. I would also reintroduce the idea of actual failure being possible, but those campaign missions would not be the be-all and end-all as they kind of were in Guild Wars 1. The idea of all the content between the campaign missions would be very Guild Wars 2 oriented. It would not be difficult. It would still be a breeze for you to go through. It would be absolutely soloable. And so in the end, the vast majority of the game's experience would be like Guild Wars 2's living world and personal story, where you can go through at your own pace, your own leisure, and you don't have to worry much. But it would definitely be accented with, 10 to 15 special missions at various choke points throughout the story that actually ask you to collaborate and play with other people. That way you get all the best of Guild Wars 1 and the best of what Guild Wars 2 did as well. I know I explained that quite loosely, but I do think there's a very good mix that they could go with. So let's move on to the next point as well. Let's talk about party sizes. Guild Wars 1 had 8-man content, sometimes 12-man, but mostly it was 8. And Guild Wars 2 is all over the shop. It started with a lot of 5-man stuff. Nowadays, for the elite endgame PvE stuff, we're thinking 10-man, though there's some 5 sprinkled in with fractals. When you look at open world stuff, especially like difficult open world events like Tech and Triple Trouble Worm, we're talking tons of players. When we're looking at World vs. World, we're often talking about having a lot of players or, sizes all across the shop. Which was really best? Well, I actually think that neither game hits it perfectly anymore, but launch Guild Wars 2 had it right. 5-man parties definitively is where I would be sitting. I think going to 10-man for raids, and maybe you've heard some of my discussions in the past about this, was a serious mistake in terms of being able to access that many players, being social with that many players, coordinating that many players to do things together, and also in terms of just the way that the combat was built for Guild Wars 2. I think that's clunky, though True Wars could have done its own thing, obviously. No, I think 5-man's a really nice number. It's not too tricky to get 4 other people or just a friend or two, and then use some kind of LFG system to plug in the last of the gaps. And also in that sense of, at a 5-man scale, you can feel how much you have contributed to various encounters. You kind of know how much damage you're responsible for doing on your target, or how much you've healed, or how much you've supported and contributed. I think you can have epic, interesting, intense raid-style encounters at the 5-man level. I don't think that any of the current really good PvE in Guild Wars 2 has to be 10-man. I would go to 5. I would also be at 5 for any other mode as well that was seeking to be heavily party-based. So the campaign missions, I'd have them either be like co-op, so it's 2-man that you're generally going to be going for, or I'd go up to 5 at most. And if there was going to be an analog for PvP and competitive play, I'd also stick that and remain that at 5-man, and I think that that's the best way to do it. I think Guild Wars 1 had it all wrong in terms of party sizes, and I think aspects of Guild Wars 2 also does. 5-man all the way. Next, let's talk about the rest of your generic kind of open world content. For Guild Wars 2, that means dynamic events, it means meta events, it means getting collections and doing achievements all the time. In Guild Wars 1, it meant fire and forget side quests that would fill up your log with walls of text, and then you just go and slam them all out and forget that they existed with mediocre rewards at the end. Well, in truth, I don't think ArenaNet's ever really been that great at this side of the game, as revolutionary and interesting as dynamic events had been. What I would do is I would keep dynamic events and metas as the primary thing and what we look at most, but I would definitely sprinkle in an idea of a real quest log with real traditional style questing. I don't think that's a toxic or dangerous thing for MMOs, and I think the only reason Guild Wars 2 has struggled with it was because of the way their manifesto went, and it feels like they kind of would be betraying themselves to do it now. But I do think that they're valuable for the game, and in return for having this mix of dynamic events, metas, and then questing in a more traditional style at the same time with a real log, I would completely remove any sense of content delivery that comes from achievement user interfaces and collections. I think all that stuff is hideous. I think finding out what to do and why in Guild Wars 2 is atrocious and poorly done. So few players will properly navigate that stuff and realize what's exciting about getting AP and finishing collections and stuff off, and it shouldn't be there. It should all be dealt with a real quest log that is transparent in what it's trying to do. That would be just gravy. Next, let's talk about the world and the idea of open world. So this is another big departure. The original was hub-based. You'd be in a small outpost, and then you load into large maps, but they were kind of isolated little sections of the world that then you traverse and do like your main job. When you killed enemies, they never respawned. There was the sense of vanquishing areas, and then you kind of move on. Guild Wars 2 is a persistent world. A lot of people use the word open world. It's not really open. An open world would be a game to me that has no loading screens or barriers anywhere. Guild Wars 2 still has this idea of isolated maps, but in terms of networking, it's no longer hub-based. You can meet people anywhere and everywhere. It's expanded the number of places that you can have opportunities for social play, and obviously dynamic events played off of that very heavily. So how would I do things? I would keep it the way that Guild Wars 2 is. I would have that real MMO sense. I wouldn't want to return to hub-based play and meeting up with people. But the way I would handle waypointing and teleportation is I'd be much more limited with it. I would have way fewer opportunities for people to travel around at max speed. And this would essentially create that idea of Guild Wars 1 outposts, but naturally in the world, because people would naturally cluster in those few places where they can actually teleport to. Whether that's the idea of a surrogates or waypoints or whatever you want to do. I mean, we could have a big discussion on that. But that would be the idea. And in terms of as well, how the areas of the world are presented, I would definitely go to a more isolated, abstract sense that Guild Wars 1 had. where you never get the sense that you fully explored Kryta. And that was very immersive and exciting and allowed our imaginations to flare. In Guild Wars 2, the maps are so big and all-encompassing with how they are printed on the world map art that it feels like we've seen everything Kryta has to offer because we've been everywhere in Kessex and Queenstown, Gandaren, and that's it, we've ran out of space. I'd return to this more abstract idea that Guild Wars 1 had, where there are just some things you can see, but not touch. And I think that would help to maintain the sense of mystery and awe and size in the world that Guild Wars 2 has lost so much of. Hand in hand with this, I would also heavily rein back in on something Guild Wars 2 prides itself on these days, and that's freedom of movement. One of the reasons the original game feels so much more immersive and large is because you just can't travel that fast around it. You can even jump in that game. I think a true Wars 2 should certainly have jumping and smooth movement with regard to combat and whatnot. But in general, as an RPG, I think Guild Wars needs to slow the hell down to become a lot more immersive and enjoyable while traversing the countryside. I don't care about gliding. I don't care about mounts. I don't think it's a smart impulse to give people copious access to move speed buffs like swiftness or 25% move speeds or gap closers and gap creators and teleporting all over the place with combat. I think all these things have been hugely detrimental to the game from an RPG immersion exploration standpoint, and my True Wars 2 would have none of it. Sorry, I know a lot of you wouldn't like to hear that. And I do love gliding and mounts as far as they were actually implemented in the end, but it's just that core concept I think I take issue with and would stand against. Next point on my list, let's talk about leveling. So famously, the original game only had 20 levels, and the point was that you would hit gear threshold and stat cap very early, and the rest was all about skill. While Guild Wars 2 expanded that level cap all the way to 80, providing various functions of the economy that are just there for low-level gameplay and massively expanding the disparity between a new character and a max-level character. Which game did it better? Well, I actually think this is a fairly arbitrary thing to talk about. Guild Wars 1 could well be harder to reach level cap, even though the number is 20, than the sequel, just because Guild Wars 1 doesn't give you free level 20 boosters whenever you buy a new expansion, and Guild Wars 1 doesn't give you free level ups every time you do any kind of competitive play, and Guild Wars 1 doesn't have so much account binding, meaning you've got massive gold sinks associated with gearing your character out and all your heroes out and getting all the skills for your character. And Guild Wars 1 is actually a bit more punishing in terms of horizontal progression, even once you're at 80, than Guild Wars 2 will ever be. All those things I just said, I think are actually probably true. So the number, 20 or 80, yes, I think it's fairly arbitrary. But the impulse that Guild Wars 2 started with, I think, is actually the more mature one, where Guild Wars 1 was rebelling against other MMOs and proclaiming that all level up systems were just gross carrots on stick to manipulate people to continue playing, and they weren't going to have any of that. Guild Wars 2 seemed to appreciate that it can be fun going from rags to riches, that it's not just there to keep people playing, but because that's actually an experience people seek out, and that you can have the balance and the skill emphasis once you're at the end of the game, but also there could be a sense of having fun leveling, that the entire game can be the end game. Now, a lot of those Guild Wars 2 philosophies and how they worked out in the end, if you know anything about me, you'll be aware I'm not impressed. Guild Wars these days is more preoccupied with rushing you through all of that stuff and pretending it doesn't exist, and sidestepping people's need to access it with as much account binding as possible, often to the applause of the contemporary player base, but I think to the detriment of the game. But with all that said, I think under the right guidance and with the right post-release support, a True Wars 2 would definitely do very well with 80 levels, a sense of a big adventure awaiting people where they do go really from rags to riches with lots of meaningful gear and stuff to acquire as they climb the ladder. Not only this, but I think a system like that would be of great benefit to the realm v realm concept of any True Wars 2. So segueing on, let's talk about this idea of world versus world. Guild Wars 1 didn't really have a world versus world. It had alliance battles, but that was little more than just a few more party members in what was already experiences you could have in places like Heroes Ascent, and with a fancy map graphic that would have a border that moves. There wasn't much of a world PvP world experience. Guild Wars 2 went really deep and tried a lot with it. There's a ton of stuff in there that had no precursor in the original game. So when it comes to picking the best of both worlds, well, I think you'd obviously end up borrowing mostly from the sequel. There is obviously no reason you have to have a Realm v Realm. Maybe you feel that ArenaNet never nailed that game type at all, and it's not necessary for an MMO to be successful. Personally, I'm actually going to cop out of this. I would have to hold my comment until I see the Alliance update still forthcoming for Guild Wars 2. If that really revitalizes the scene and gives people their sense of server pride, or as it will now be known as Alliance pride, back, if people derive real meaning from it, build strong communities again, and the gameplay inherent to it is just super awesome, then I think it'd be pretty easy to say, well, yeah, just do that for True Wars 2. But until that time, I'm lukewarm on the whole concept, and I wouldn't even be sad to see a True Wars 2 not have it at all. Similarly, there's also the sense of competitive PvP to talk about. Maybe for this you feel that the game shouldn't have it. To me, I think a True Wars 2 would have a competitive PvP scene, just because Guild Wars 1 really did go very deep into that and was reasonably successful for a time. People often overstate how successful it was, but I do think it's in this franchise's DNA, what with its MTG origins and the mindset the devs had when they set out on all of this way back in the day. But I tell you, I wouldn't hate the idea of a Guild Wars game that has neither PvP nor World versus World at all. I don't necessarily think that that would be a bad thing. One of the big problems with this game, this franchise over the years, is the way they've tried to support multiple extremely distinct game types that have fractured the community. People have come to expect and want very different things from development time, even growing to resent those who play other areas. PvPers resenting PvEers when they get updates, the same for World versus World. PvEers resenting when some skill or something gets nerfed that they don't feel was justifiably so, just because there was a little gimmick with it out somewhere in World versus Worlds. These haven't actually been good things in terms of community unity and developers understanding what they should be developing and why. You told me that there was going to be a game with none of it? Fine. However, to circle back to the idea of PvP, I would certainly want some competitive mode. I think it is true to this franchise, and the question becomes, what would it look like? GVG, Heroes Ascent, or Guild Wars 2's Conquest and Stronghold, and now 2v2s and whatnot? Well, this is a fun one. I actually think that the launch infrastructure in terms of itemization, ranking, and separating everything away for Guild Wars 2 was really good. The original implementation pre-Feature Pack 2, Heart of the Mists, was excellent and much better than the Battle Isles of Guild Wars 1. So all of that stuff, I would love. I would also love it if a True Wars 2 had today's Guild Wars 2 queuing systems for ranked, unranked, hot joins, and tournaments, special tournaments that roll through. A lot of the rewards that are there now are pretty good as well in terms of exclusive rewards, just not how you get them. I think all of that would be brilliant. I would love the best of the early days of Guild Wars 2's infrastructure, where there was clarity behind what gear you were getting, what was unlocking for doing what, going up through the animals, with today's actual networking infrastructure and queuing stuff, which didn't exist originally. I'd love all of that, and then for the game itself, I would not look at Conquest. I don't think so. If you asked me if the devs should abandon Conquest now for Guild Wars 2, my answer would be no, but if they could create a fresh slate, we all know what people have been asking for. GVGs. I would have some kind of 5-man scaled GVG experience. And I'm sorry if that game type doesn't end up landing in a 10 to 15 minute bite-sized match window and it goes to 40 to 50 minutes, which is out of fashion with contemporary gaming. That's what people want. That's what people are mostly nostalgic about, and that's what I'd be an advocate for too. If not GVG, I was also a huge fan of Heroes Ascent, a bigger fan of Heroes Ascent really, and I'd love to see any kind of True Wars 2 dive into that. That's kind of maybe more of a matchmaking side thing, but there it is. I'd also say, by the way, I don't think the concept of hot joins are necessary whatsoever, and wouldn't be sad to see them cut. Moving on, I've got a couple of small points here. There's not massive discussions to get out of them, but I would love to see. I think any kind of True Wars 2, in terms of skill acquisition, would revive skill capping. Come on! Skill capping is another one of those things that was genuinely really fun, well implemented in the original game, has a lot of fans, and was removed in the sequel in favor of what exactly? Just unlocking skills in the user interface. Guild Wars 2's reliance on the UI instead of making features out of getting access to new stuff has always been something I disliked. Skill capturing would be a thing in True Wars 2. Go out in the world, hunt bosses, learn new capabilities from them, make that a meaningful part of the RPG. They had it perfect before, and they turned their back on it in the name of accessibility, like so much else. Next, I've got a few thoughts in terms of sales and boxes and so on. So the original game had this concept of campaigns. Each product they released was totally standalone, had its own leveling experience, had its own tutorials that became increasingly more bloated and difficult to get their message across into design, and you could buy all of them together and combine them if you liked, obviously. The idea was to rapidly release those. I don't actually believe in that. I think Guild Wars 2 did better. You have your base game and expansions coming out on top of it. I think that the way they've got it monetized is brilliant right now. There are some slight things I'd tweak about the gem store, but I'd have all of that Guild Wars 2 infrastructure. But on top of that, I would like to return to CGI cutscenes like we had for Prophecies and Factions. I know that they weren't there for Nightfall and Eye of the North, so you might not even say that really it's a Guild Wars thing. But I would love to see CGI cutscenes, and I'd also love to see Collector's Edition. We had a Collector's Edition for Guild Wars 2 Core, sorry. But why not the expansions? Where was the Heart of Thorns Collector's Edition? Where was the Path of Fire one? True Wars 2 would have badass Collector's Editions, and I would definitely want to see that come back. Next, let's talk about PvE and enemy skills, and a feature and facet of Guild Wars 1 that was deleted for Guild Wars 2, but I would definitely go back to the original for, and that's the idea of having enemies using player skills. Now, this is a curious one. See, you may not realize this, but back in the original game, everything you fought was using player abilities. And that meant that when a balance pass came in, if they buffed ice magic, then not only were you excited as a player because now you could use more ice magic stuff, but also it radically changed a lot of PvE, because now in icy areas where you're fighting ice imps that use ice magic stuff, they may have become stronger now, or worse now. So the devs removed this in the sequel because, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a balance nightmare, and it did lead to some very ugly stuff in Guild Wars 1. You'd have like a buff to Meteor Shower purely because of GVG, and all of a sudden one of the Ascalon areas is impossibly difficult to deal with. Or the flavor behind a particular type of Deldramore caster revolved around their elite skill that has now been totally changed, and it feels really weird. There were a lot of downsides to it, and it was a very delicate balancing act that I can absolutely understand why the devs moved away from as best they could, though facets of it remain in the sequel anyway. Did you know that whenever they buff Shatterstone for the Elementalists, it's actually buffing one of the jumping puzzles in the game as well that uses Shatterstone as an environmental hazard? In any case, for all of its downsides, there is something beautiful about Guild Wars 1, being able to fight against the Hydra and know what Meteor is before it comes because you're an Elementalist and you've been using it. And there's something beautiful about the sense of PvE dynamically changing so much just because of balance patches. There's a whole other facet of balance that made the game a little bit more exciting. And it's something I was especially struck by over this past year and the year before, where I did recent stream playthroughs of Nightfall and Factions. You get so much flavor and emphasis and excitement out of the enemies in the world because they're hooking into the same skills the devs are making as cool as possible for the players. And it's so much more exciting and interesting playing regular PvE running around the world in Guild Wars 1 than it is in Guild Wars 2, where you're just fighting generic Ettins that like slam at you and are just boring and slow and never particularly interesting. It's cool, and I'd love to see it come back. There's so much renewable gameplay and experience that can come from that any True Wars 2 I'd like to see hone in on. And on a similar topic as well, another thing would be hard mode. Guild Wars 1 had this sense that you could beat the game and then you could beat it a second time, and now enemies that never had elite skills before now do. And then they also get a bunch of shameless buffs like increased cast speed and cooldown reduction and movement speed and so on. That idea of hard mode I think paid off really well for Guild Wars 1, even if it was just a band-aid to keep people playing till Eye of the North came out. I would like to see something similar for a True Wars 2. To me, a concept like that represents something. The idea that it's okay to go back through and play the PvE content. You've done it once as you were leveling, now do it all at level cap and see how challenging it can be there. And then maybe do it again in ultra hard mode afterwards. That entire concept, I think, is brilliant for player retention and renewable content, and the devs threw it all away in the sequel. I don't know why. We've played with it a little bit, the idea of challenge motes and the nightmare mote we saw for the end boss of Heart of Thorns, but they've never done it very well, and they had it all figured out way back on their original game. I know some things would have to change. With respawning enemies, you can't necessarily do the vanquishing idea, but the spirit of hard mode is not contingent purely on the idea of vanquishing existing. Not to me, anyway. I'll finish up the video with one final point. I'm sure there's a million other little things I could talk about, but here's a big one that I'm sure will be controversial in some of your eyes. It's to do with the economy. Here is something I very much believe in. What do you do about the trading post? Guild Wars 1 was a barter-oriented game with direct player trading and very low caps on the amount of standard currency you could hold. You can only get 100 platinum on an individual character and only 1,000 platinum in your bank. After that, you're going to have to look at other items as Foley currencies and trade with those. Thus are born Ectos. Thus are born Arm Braces of Truth. Thus is born interesting mini trading. Thus is born a huge amount of socializing and discussion, even if it is just spammy trade chat in the various towns and outposts of the game. That even goes on to this day in a largely dead game. You go to Kamadan, it feels extremely alive just because of the trade chat that's there. Some of my fondest memories of Guild Wars 1 were flipping really high value items and seeing tons of Ecto flooding in after I held on to a certain investment or whatever. In Guild Wars 2, all of that is gone in favor of the trading post. I mean, there are some items that are worth so much you get around the trading post and trade through other people and use other currencies, but in general, it's all gone in favor of the TP. I have no happy or interesting memories of trading or socializing or spending meaningful time in any town or outpost with the trading post. I know it is a matter of convenience, and I know that I'm probably forgetting all the long, boring hours I spent standing around in those houseboats before. But if I sum up both games, which one gave me the more meaningful experience? Guild Wars 1 did. True Wars 2 would have no trading post, and I would probably also have a low cap on the currencies as well, just to mix up the economy and create that interesting barter system that you only really see in any other game being Path of Exile, I think, for contemporary gaming. And I think that's a shame. True Wars 2, to me, would return more to the Guild Wars 1 style of things. Convenience be damned. And I think that last sentence I just gave you pretty much sums up my thoughts on most of this. So there you go, guys. Thanks very much for watching. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Your perfect version of the two games would be. You're open to give me a wild card as well. Maybe if there was another Guild Wars, or even you could have been thinking of the idea of a Guild Wars 3, it goes off on a completely different tangent and seeks to be like neither of the prior games. An interesting idea I'd totally be on board with, as long as they continue to support their existing products. And we saw that when Guild Wars 2 came out, even though it was so different to the original, they still left the original to rot in a grave. And I think that's a bit of a shame. Cheers, guys. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you tomorrow.